Good afternoon. Is it working? Good afternoon. Yeah, maybe it's working. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second and last day of the conference and last session, which you see in the program, we've broken into two to give everybody a brief break before we start the second half of this session. And let me remind you and tell those who weren't here yesterday that books written by our speakers are available over at that table. And also, there is a table that has the journal Social Research, which will, of course, publish the proceedings or papers from this conference, which will be our winter 1919 issue, which can be pre-ordered at the Social Research table, should you be so inclined, and we'd be delighted if you were so inclined. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, which will deal with forgeries in art. And it's my pleasure to introduce Maria Gonzalez Pendas, who is an architect and architectural historian whose work explores the history of modern architecture, and where she looks at the history of modern architecture with the politics precisely or more directly of fascism and the process of secularization and development in Spain and Mexico. Some of this work can be found in her book, Wholly Modern, A Spatial History of Fascism, Catholicism, and Technology at Mid-Century. She is currently a fellow at the Heyman Center at Columbia, and as I hope you all know, the Heyman Center is the co-sponsor of this conference and has helped a lot with making it possible. So, Maria.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the conference, Cons and Scams, Their Place in American Culture. It is my pleasure to be moderating the opening panel of the day and our two speakers. The panel that is dedicated to the ways in which cons, scams, forgeries, and other forms of delusion have been produced by and within the arts. This is probably the case with every panel that you have heard and all of the moderators, but I happen to believe that this is the panel, and this is the concept, the arts, that is best positioned to understand the fascinating arrays of strategies and stories of deceit. I think that the arts hold many of the answers that we're looking for. For one can argue that the practices and objects that derive from aesthetic programs, sensorial epistemologies, and visual representation, as well as media worlds, are inevitably always invested in the production of illusions or illusory effects, and are therefore particularly well positioned for the staging of delusions and other tricks, which is the main object of analysis and discussion in this conference. As is the premise of the conference, cons and scams not only pervade our contemporary culture to persistent, if persistently astounding success, but they're also notoriously difficult to understand psychologically, sociologically, and historically. Cons and scams are resistant to scrutiny by design, if you will. This difficulty has perhaps rooted much of the romantic reception of the conman, a romanticism that has redeemed forgers for quite some time, and that this conference and our speakers today aim in part to dismantle in light of the very real and really troubling effects of a collective scam in our political present. The bottom line of all cons and scams is essentially artistic, I would argue, as per a precise construction of illusions through the design of diversion effects, hiding screens, and rhetorical devices, destined to produce a double reality, a twofold world where what is seen is but a representation of what might or might not be happening behind the curtain. This double world, at the most basic, the techniques, objects, and languages of representation, is the world of media and the arts, and a world that our speakers will open up for us in fascinating ways, especially as they double down on the deceptive strategies proper to the arts and media by revealing stories behind art forgers and counterfeit artists. Before I introduce them, or I introduce the first one, the first of them, oops, sorry. So before I introduce them, I want to make a point to note how arts, aesthetics, and media encompass not only the visual realm, but also, and more pressingly, the realms of the sensorial, the historical construct of emotion, as well as the broader realms of cultural production and cultural economy. This is the intersection that our speakers unlock in their work, and it's also the intersection at which Walter Benjamin famously positioned the defining power of fascism. So what? Are you having trouble hearing me? Oh no. All right. Okay, so I'm just gonna. Yes, okay, so the arts, aesthetics, and media encompass not only the visual realm, but also, and more pressingly, the realms of the sensorial, or the historical constructs of emotion, as well as the broader realms of cultural production and cultural economy. And this is the intersection that both of our speakers unlock in their work, but it's also the intersection at which Walter Benjamin famously positioned the defining power of fascism in the 1930s in the aestheticization of politics, where a political culture is activated as a sensorial experience and not, and specifically not, as recent debate, much less the pursuit of truth, historical or not, or otherwise. All the more need then today to turn to debate and to scholarship, especially scholarship in the arts and aesthetics, I would say, and especially from our two speakers who have been thinking about these issues for quite some time and in highly original and sophisticated ways. First, we will hear from Lainey Salisbury, a journalist, writer, and a teacher at the University at Albany, State University of New York, where she is particularly drawn to instill appreciation for the First Amendment among her students. Her work has taken her to the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and throughout the United States, and she was an editor for the Associated Press and a reporter for Reuters. Her books include The Cruel Smiles, The Heroic Story of Dogs and Men in a Race Against an Epidemic, and more recently, Provenance, How a Conman and a Forger Rewrote the History of Modern Art. So please help me in welcoming Lainey to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming. So often in the case of art forgery, the artist is also the con artist, the con man. Okay, I get kind of tall. Should I lift it higher? Is that good? I think I'm going to make it worse.
I will try. That might be a little better.
Good. How's that? No? Is that better? Okay, here I go. All right, so often in the case of art forgery, the artist is also the con man. And these forging con artists, they have been around for as long as civilization. Scholars have found that as far back as 600 BC, priests from an important temple faked cuneiform script on a clay tablet to make it appear 1,000 years older. And their motivation was that their status at the time was being challenged. And from that status, they got tax revenues and they had privileges. So they wanted to give it this stamp of antiquity. What they wrote on this cuneiform, on this clay tablet, appears kind of quaint when you compare it to today's fake news that is coming out on social media. And they wrote, "He who will damage this document, let Enki, the god of water, fill up his canals with slime." So people were as susceptible to forgeries back then as they are today. Forgeries have become more sophisticated. They've become more prevalent, but we as a human species have remained the same. We are still susceptible because of our fears and our longings. The motivations behind art forgery they're as varied as the types of forgers. They have been done over the past centuries in the name of rebellion, resentment, self-affirmation, pride, and of course, greed. In ancient Rome, when classical Greek sculptures became a status symbol and in high demand, Rome's craftsmen quickly got to work. During the 15th and 16th centuries, masters forged masters out of hubris. In the late 1480s, a young Michelangelo painted a portrait in the style of his master, Ghirlandaio. And he did it on wooden panels, and he doctored them with smoke to make them look older. He was already a pretty good artist at the time. Later, he sculpted a Cupid sleeping just to see if he could do it, and then he passed it off as an antiquity. But art forgery really blossomed in the mid to late 20th century, when buyers and sellers and dealers started to look at art increasingly as a commodity. Part of this commoditization of art had to do with the expansion of our global marketplace, of the stock markets. Another part had to do with there was this influx of young moneyed professionals. And if you could add art to your portfolio, you were given sort of a sophistication and a culture that no stock holding or mutual fund could provide. It was sort of a cachet. So as art increasingly became a commodity, then we started seeing the branding and marketing of artists to the point where their brand was almost as important as the art itself. And perhaps this was best illustrated when Sotheby's, one of the largest auction houses, was bought by an American shopping mall mogul whose assets included A&W root beer chain. And soon after he bought the company, Alfred Talman told a group of young businessmen and women that the marketing of fine art is not much different from any of his other products. And he told the crowd, there is more similarity in a precious painting by Gogh and a frosted mug of root beer than you ever thought possible. So suddenly, not suddenly, but over time, more traditional collectors who had once mostly been guided by aesthetics and scholarship found they had to compete against business tycoons, stockbrokers, and hedge fund managers whose wealth and investment ambitions started to drive up prices. So you combine the rising prices with a market or a business that has a general lack of regulation and at times questionable business practices, and art becomes easy prey for forgers and, as more and more police are seeing, art crime, just straight out thievery. So, given the long history and nature of art forgery, it's impossible to calculate just how many are out there circulating. The late museum executive Thomas Hoving is quite famously known for saying that during his tenure at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he was there for 16 or 18 years in the 60s and 70s, of the 50,000 works that came through the museum, 40% were fake or just so compromised by poor restoration that they were no longer authentic. That 40% figure has been repeated throughout the past decades. One scholar in Switzerland, he does run a company that verifies the authenticity of works. He puts the number that come through his door at 70 to 90%. So for scholars and those who can afford to do business in the art world, the figures are disturbing. For the rest of the public, we're kind of conflicted about art forgery. Art forgers, when they are caught, rarely fail to capture our attention. Their stories, usually of intrigue, include intrigue, deceit, lots of talent, and harm. They're as fascinating, as entertaining as they are newsworthy. Forgers have bankrupted galleries and dealers, they've broken up relationships, and they've led to litigious claims and counterclaims that get snarled up in the courts for years. And despite this wake of destruction, many of us, myself included, find something really delicious about these crimes. Without a doubt, they're criminals, and they deserve the full impact of the law, but they're also endearing rogues. And their schemes sometimes feel like they deserve some light applause. in part because when they are exposed, they often show an industry that, to at least outsiders, can seem like one big con itself. For one, the business of art, selling art, is notoriously opaque. As one historian put it, value, authenticity, and even the answer as to what is art are determined by this secretive, mysterious consensus that sometimes seems built on the most fragile of foundations. Of late, those fragile foundations have included secret bidding at auction, and sometimes these bidders are dealers or owners of works that have a stake in the financial outcome. Also, we find in this business that sometimes dealers who know that a work is fake pass it off because it's too complicated to shout that it's not authentic. So art has become so commodified and looked at as a collectible that it's really easy to forget what gets lost. And I wouldn't be the first to say that art is supposed to be the test of the quality of a nation's civilization. And if that's the case, we're failing. The public today can barely see art, let alone afford to buy a work. According to a survey of 212 museums across the US, Canada, and Mexico, 60% charge an admission fee, and that can be as high as $25, $26, $27. Among those museums that do offer admission for free, 23% will charge when there's a special exhibit. And since 2002, admissions to museums have been dropping. And over the past 10 years, they've declined by 20%. And then when you take that and combine it to what's happening in our schools, what's happening at our institutions, art is not really getting the funding that it used to get. Even though studies show that art helps reduce violence in schools, art helps to reduce anxiety among school children, and school children tend to see a boost in their critical thinking skills when you present them with art. So there's a consequence to all this. Museums compete now not against millionaires, but against billionaires in auctions and at private sales. And if a member of the public is lucky enough to be at the auction of an auction house to see the paintings go for sale, they might catch a glimpse of a great work of art before it's hustled away. This happened in November. A painting by Leonardo da Vinci was bought by a Saudi prince from a Russian billionaire, and the cost was $450.3 million, even though some doubt its authenticity. Before that, the record was $300 million. At those prices, all that's really left for the public to enjoy about art is to read about it in the newspapers. And that, of course, is free. So with these factors, it's really hard for any of us to resist reveling in a story about a talented artist, usually male, whose work had been rejected by the art establishment, fool what's considered the standard bearers of high taste. So our attitude about art forgers is reflected also in the prison sentences they tend to receive, and then their subsequent embrace when they are released. I looked at a lot of forgers, and in the book I focused on one called John Myatt. He painted more than 200 fakes in one of Britain's most extensive art forgery cases. He received 1 year in prison. He was let out after 4 months. When he was in prison, he was popular. People called him Picasso because he would paint their portrait in exchange for cell phone cards. The day after he got out, the detective, who was an art historian and put him away, hired him to paint a family portrait for $7,000. Then the prosecutor of the case knocked on his door. Now Myatt has a successful business painting what's called genuine fakes. He appears on TV shows, he's in documentaries, and he speaks at conferences on art fraud. He also exhibits now more frequently than he used to, and his works, once rejected by the art world, have sold for as much as $68,000. So like many forgers who have preceded him, Myatt is a hero of sorts, and his fame derives from having deceived. His partner, though, fared much worse. Unlike many of the other art forgery cases, John Myatt wasn't a straight-out con artist. His partner, John Drew, was, or is. John Drew also deceived, and he also broke laws. He got 6 years in prison, and he never captured the public's imagination, even though his schemes were extremely elaborate, varied, and inventive. Drew was not an artist, but given the fact that he took on at least 7 personas, and he was the mastermind of about 6 or 7 other subcons at the same time that he was doing this one large art con. Some people have said it was a little bit like he was a street performance artist because he kept it up for so long. But what John Drew did was he managed to forge the documents or the history that went with all of the fakes. And he gave each one a very celebrated, fascinating history. And he shifted everyone's attention from the artwork to the documents. So even when someone suspected something, they bought the painting because they liked its history. And this is even though even Myatt admitted that most of the works that he painted were horrible. And all of the works he painted, he used paint from his local hardware store. So he'd go out and get Benjamin Moore and do his work. But the problem with Drew is he crossed a line. In order for him to build up his persona, in order for him to rent his Bentleys and to take people out for expensive lunches in order to pull off his con, he did so mostly by taking advantage of those who have been down on their luck. He made no distinctions among his marks. He conned close friends, including his children and his ex-wife, and hardworking researchers, art researchers, and even John Myatt, who all sold works on his behalf, stored works for him, and even participated in meetings with him, not really fully understanding what his goals were. So in his wake, he left a lot of victims questioning not about the art world, but really about themselves and their belief in themselves and their trust in the world. So it's hard to identify with him or applaud him. His sociopathy and complete disregard for the truth was too sinister. And because of that, he was forgotten until he conned again. And that time it was a widow for $700,000. Meanwhile, Myatt remains a celebrity, as if the people he had conned, mostly the art dealers, the people who authenticate artworks, and the auction houses deserved it. His crimes are seen as victimless because they hurt those who seem to know better, as if they should know better, and also that they also seem a little guilty in conspiring to keep art out of public view. So such attitudes are only reinforced when multi-million-dollar sales occur, in which the names of the buyer or the seller remain anonymous, or when estimates are not listed, or when the 2 largest auction houses in 2000 agreed to pay millions of dollars to settle claims that they had colluded to fix prices and fees, some of which favored the wealthiest of collectors. Myatt, penniless, and at the time even a humble painter, was, like many forgers before him, a David up against a Goliath. And about 40 years before Myatt, there were others like him too, who also became sort of national figures in Britain and elsewhere. Tom Keating claimed he forged more than 2,000 works in the style of hundreds of artists. He had hoped to make a life out of painting art, but he was rejected, so he was determined to honor all the painters who had died in penury. But he made it easy for the dealers on purpose. He would sprinkle dust from a vacuum cleaner on his paintings. He would take Nescafe and stimulate foxing on his paintings. And on some of them, he even wrote in lead white paint underneath his own work, "This is a fake. Have you ever been had?" And he was finally, after years, it took a while, he was finally caught. And the dealers got together and said, let's not sell any of his works. But over time, the public said, we want them. So now they can be bought for $18,000. Around the same time, the late English artist Eric Hebborn was faking old masters, including Rubens and Tiepolo, and selling them through the art auction houses on his own. Like Keating, he had also been rejected as not good enough, but his fakes were. By his own account, he produced more than 1,000 of them. They were declared stylistically brilliant, and then they ended up in esteemed collections. What finally gave him away was his choice of paper. So he too was viewed as a beloved outlaw. And he had a self-declared moral guidelines of sorts. He said he would never sell a work to someone who was not a recognized expert. It was too easy. And it would also rob him of the satisfaction, and it would rob him of the message. So like Myatt, Hebron too, his works started to sell. In 2014, a collection of his works sold at auction for nearly $80,000, more than 5 times what was expected. And more recently, there's been the peculiar tale of Mark Landis. He was a prolific forger who was never charged with a crime because he gave his works away. And he visited nearly 40 museums in the US. He was is a recluse. He's extremely timid, and he used many aliases, including a Jesuit priest who had an art collection, as well as a family member who had an art collection who was giving works away in the name of his sister and his mother. And he didn't forge out of rebellion or for money. He did it because he liked how he was treated when he told people he had an art collection. One headline referred to him as an unlikely folk hero. So while there is an inherent contradiction that the works of forgers eventually become valuable and a collector's items, they do serve a purpose. They are a moral shout out to the art world to look at art for what it is, not for what it's worth. Some people even see forgeries as a healthy component to the art system, as long as the number of forgeries don't exceed the authentic works that are out there. Excuse me, I'm getting a cold. So oddly, the role of providing art to the public can sometimes be seen as being done by the forgers now. Myatt no longer sees himself as a criminal. With the reassurance of the public, he now talks about himself as someone who provides access to art on art's terms. He once said, "I quite like the idea that people can look at my paintings and decide whether they like it or not without all the high art bollocks. They haven't got to stand in front of it and say, oh, it's a Van Gogh, so we have to like it." It gives people a chance to see past that. Hans van Meegeren, who stood trial for allegedly selling Dutch national treasures to the Nazis in the 30s and 40s. These were works he forged. In order for him to defend himself, he painted a fake at the trial to say, yeah, I did these. And his works sold for hundreds of thousands of guilders at the time. And he said something similar to Myatt. You know, he said, "Yesterday, one of my works, this picture was worth millions of guilders, and experts and art lovers would come from all over the world and pay money to see it. Today it is worth nothing, and nobody would cross the street to see it for free. But the picture has not changed. What has? To the untrained eye, perhaps nothing. But for those who take the study of art seriously, everything. Forgeries that go undetected have serious consequences to culture. They diminish it and they demean it. Art forgery, however riveting these crimes and entertaining they may be, do contaminate history with as much effect and power as a fake document destroys or distorts or falsifies our understanding of a historical event. Famous forgers, like Myatt and like Keating and Hebron at their times, always prided themselves on not identifying the numerous fakes that are still out there, because they feel concerned for the owners and for their own pride. They like knowing they're out there. But they really should be condemned a lot more than they are for doing that, because we shouldn't allow for any falsehoods to stand uncorrected and think it's okay, particularly not in the era we're in now. Our standards are obviously lowering. Originals, as the cultural art critic Walter Benjamin once wrote, are intimately connected with a particular time and space that cannot be repeated. And that's what gives a Van Gogh this special aura, or a Picasso a special aura. Once we start tampering with that, we're not allowing scholars of art to fully understand the present. If we seed the canon of an artist's work with fakes and forgeries, what happens is by brushstroke, by minuscule brushstroke, we just get removed further and further from what is real. And that should stand for whether it's a painting or a politician or an historian. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful, much food for thought, which is going to be only amplified now by the presentation of Maggie Chow. Is it? Oh dear, thank you. She is the David G. Frey Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 2014 and completed postdoctoral work at the Columbia University Society of Fellows. Chow is a historian of American art whose research focuses on intersections of art with science and economics, as well as the environmental humanities. Her first book, which is about to come out, is titled The End of Landscape in 19th Century America, and explores the dissolution of landscape painting as a major cultural project in the late 19th century United States. She is currently working on a project entitled New Media in the Age of Sale, which examines new art forms that emerge from contexts of global commerce in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you, Maggie.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction, Maria, and I'm really pleased to be part of this great event. So thank you to the organizers and everything for including me. This is I'm taking you back to the 19th century to think about what it means to counterfeit art and to the meanings of forgery in a broad sense. The most counterfeited artist in American history is not who you might expect. Now largely forgotten, the name Ralph Blakelock was legendary around 1900. Arguably the most famous artist during the first decades of the 20th century, Blakelock was, according to the press, as well known as Rembrandt and Da Vinci. So respected was this painter that when he died in 1919, even the president, Woodrow Wilson, sent his regrets for not having been able to pay his respects in person. Blakelock's Nocturnes, these are paintings of night. If the lights could be dimmed a little bit, that would be helpful. Blakelock's Nocturnes, these are paintings of night, as like the one that you see here. This one in particular became the most expensive painting by a living American artist when it was sold at auction for $20,000 in 1916. These paintings were so coveted by collectors that their rampant forgery called for an investigation by the New York District Attorney. So, who was Ralph Blakelock, and what can his counterfeits teach us about cons and scams? I'm interested in sharing Blakelock's story, not because I actually think that his work is worthy of a Rembrandt or a Leonardo, but rather because I think it's quite revealing of a period-specific fascination with the trustworthiness of representation, both visual and monetary. Indeed, it would be impossible to even tell this story at all without the consideration of economic contexts, both in the ways in which the market determined this artist's fate and the fact that Blakelock himself was obsessed with matters of money. And those of you who had a chance to read the quote that the first slide, it was comparing Andrew Carnegie to Blakelock as two people who died on the same day, were both one being actually the richest man and the other thinking he is the richest man. So I hope what you will get out of this next 20 minutes or so is the ways in which Blakelock's fate, quite a multi-layered history of cons and scams, offers a window into the intersection of artistic and economic duplicity that has been with us for quite a long time. So Blakelock's career began as a landscape painter in New York in the mid-1860s. He was in fact born just not too far from here on Christopher Street. And as a young man, he traveled to the American West. Here are some of his sketches. In an attempt to replicate the success of these type of painter at that time who, ventured far afield and then painted these grand landscapes and showcased them back in New York and other cities on the East Coast. And they made huge huge sums of money on these, on this kind of expeditionary project. But Blakelock was unable to cash in on frontier pictures. So he began painting landscapes like this. These are very eerie, moonlit, sunset type of scenes. Sometimes they reference the West, so the one on the left is called Indian Encampment. But they received very little attention from critics, and so the artist had not very many buyers during his most productive years. Then in 1899, penniless and desperate with a large family to support, Blakelock suffered an emotional breakdown, and he committed himself to the Middletown Homeopathic Hospital in upstate New York and lived there for the next 17 years, but still painting, though not these kinds of canvases. I'll show you kind of some things that he did there. So while confined, his reputation took a dramatic turn. Newly branded the American Van Gogh, shorthand for sort of mad genius artist, the National Academy of Design inaugurated him as an academician, which is a very important sign of accomplishment if you were a New York painter in the 19th century. And a gallery in New York mounted a major retrospective of his work, and international expositions from San Francisco to Paris clamored for his now famous nocturnes. Which, because of his breakdown and his sort of asylum residence, were now interpreted as a kind of spiritual dreamscape. So Blakelock, essentially, because of his mental status, had become an art world celebrity, subject then to both critical and criminal attention. So to be sure, Blakelock's marketability at this point in his life, the record prices now garnered for his work, can be attributed to what in the late 19th century was a kind of assumption that genius and insanity were linked. But Blakelock's fame extends beyond creativity and madness to matters of cash and capital. Enter the con artist. Shortly after the record-breaking sale of 1916, that painting I showed you, which was sold for $20,000, a woman by the name of Mrs. Beatrice van Rensselaer Adams took an interest in Blakelock's case. Adams was known in and around New York City as a philanthropic matron who had been enormously successful in soliciting support from the city's prominent industrialists and financiers for the education of women and children in the South and other charitable foundations. Aware of the market commotion around Blakelock, she turned to him as her next cause. So she incorporated a fund called the Blakelock Fund. She recruited prominent figures from the art and business world in New York to serve on its board, and she quickly raised what was then a whopping sum of $35,000 to improve the living and working conditions of the artist, so he might, as she put it, give the world more of his art. As self-appointed secretary of this fund, she took on the role of publicist and promoter of Blakelock's work and orchestrated a number of exhibitions and public appearances by the artist, as well as tours that he would do, which then were eagerly picked up by the press, therefore perpetuating the mythologies associated with the artist and raising his reputation on the market. Without consent of Blakelock's wife and children, she somehow managed to obtain legal guardianship over the artist and moved him from the state-run hospital in Middletown to a house and studio at a private sanatorium, no doubt anticipating that she could cash in on the next great masterpieces he would produce under her care, essentially cornering the market on his new artwork. And although Blakelock's fans regarded Adams as his most sincere benefactor, she was but a master swindler with a very shadowy history. Born Sadie Filbert, the daughter of a housekeeper in a small industrial town up the Hudson, Adams had moved to New York as a teenager and married Louise Adams, a con man whose crime was swindling young women into giving up large sums of money for promised positions in city firms. And as you might have guessed, these positions would never materialize. And when he was jailed for his crimes, Sadie feigned innocence and orphaned her children and became a confidence woman herself. Reversing the gender dynamics of her husband's schemes, she took to convincing influential older men to support worthy causes and use their charity dollars to prop up her social standing and draw a handsome income. The Blakelock Fund was her most sophisticated scam to date, though it did not last long. By 1918, the fund had dwindled to meager sums on account of the artist's lack of productivity and Adams's own lavish expenditures. Attempting to avoid the scrutiny of the press and the artist's increasingly suspicious family members, she relocated the artist several times during the last year of his life, despite his failing health, until eventually he collapsed and he died under her care at a summer cottage in the Adirondacks. So we are probably likely to sympathize with Blakelock as a victim, or maybe he was an enabler, I don't know, because of all the discussion yesterday, because she was conning the donors. The artist was hardly naive and unworldly as the press had made him out to be. The artist's biographer may have written in 1913 that he was, quote, a dreamer not always wise in the use of monies. But actually, Blakelock was deeply invested in his worth on the market. He thought a lot about this. He was really interested in money and what his paintings were worth. And so much so that he was engaged in his own confidence game of sorts. So in 1916, the very year that Mrs. Adams entered his life, Blakelock was visited at Middletown Hospital by a collector named William Kresmer, who's from Chicago. And after Blakelock had shown this collector some of his work and discussed with him the pictures for which he was famous, he pulled from his pocket a thick bankroll of currency and presented Kresmer with these 3 bills. Each is a monochrome landscape painted on cloth with watercolor, and each in size and color precisely replicates then circulating banknotes. The yellow bill notably bears a hefty $80 million sum. You can see that faintly inscribed on the left edge. So Kresmer, who documented this event some years later, recalled Blakelock having given him very careful instructions when giving him this gift. He said, "Don't spend it. Live on the interest the rest of your life." So much like Adams's scheme to defraud the artist, Blakelock's own philanthropic, you might say, act actually involves a compounding of fraudulent claims. The circulation of fake currency, as well as the fabrication of a false identity. So here the artist is a millionaire, even though he's not. As we learned yesterday, the con is not about stealing. It's rather about tricking someone into freely giving up what they have. And it is precisely the gift that animates this story. It's all about charity. The artist's own gambit makes a farce of the gift of patronage by reversing the power and money dynamics, the imbalance that is typically assigned such transactions. Blakelock's handmade currency has long been dismissed as the machinations of mental illness, but suppose we give them conceptual credibility as works of art, which they are, of course. They're paintings on cloth, which is what painting, what we usually think of as art. If we take them seriously, then they are not so different than the absurdist art of the early 20th century art world of artists like Marcel Duchamp of the Fountain fame, particularly this work by Duchamp, an entirely hand-drawn check which Duchamp used to pay his dentist, who just happened to be an art collector. So you can see this is actually all hand-drawn, so none of it is printed, and it's the account from which it's taken is the Teeth's Loan and Trust Company Consolidated of Wall Street. So the meaning of Blakelock's falsified bills emerges not from the categorical incompatibility of art and money, which is the basis of Marcel Duchamp's gesture, but from their even stranger equivalence. So whereas Duchamp turned a bureaucratic document into art by signing it, Blakelock's stockpile of homemade money follows the opposite trajectory, turning art into money. On the one hand, you could say, this conversion is simply literalizing commonplace art market transactions. But on the other, it does something much more ambitious in that it stages an artist-centered economy complete with its own currency, a kind of parallel universe of the con. It's worth noting here that Blakelock was known to call the asylum where he resided a trading post, where he would carry out these dubious transactions. So in that sense, he's gesturing to the West, the frontier West, where he began his career. And in that space, cash scarcity did often drive a kind of use of alternative currencies, like foreign currencies, home, sort of community-based currencies. So Blakelock's painted banknotes also, though, reference another kind of scam, and that is the counterfeit, a problem that links discourses of art and money during this period. So the monetary counterfeit, the classic fake banknote, sits at the margins of art because it is a literal visual representation of money. And indeed, there was an entire artistic practice at the end of the 19th century that relied on this idea. And these are artworks, these are called trompe-l'oeil, still lifes, and they feature money. These paintings are very hyper-realistic representations. This is an example by the artist William Harnett. And they became very popular in cities like New York in the late 19th century, where they were hung in hotels, saloons, shops, other spaces of middle-class leisure, where they attracted curious viewers who were duped into trying to take the money off the wall, literally, because they would see these paintings and think that this was actually a dollar bill hanging on the wall. And also, like Barnum's Museum, these paintings solicited a kind of pleasure in not just being tricked, but in watching others being tricked. So you'd go to these spaces and you'd see who gets fooled by these paintings, Harnett was actually, in fact, questioned by the Secret Service because rumors spread that he was painting counterfeit currency because of these kind of cons that the artists were involved in. And in other paintings of this type, painters actually take on, in a sense, the identity of the counterfeiter, referencing the fact that although their work is not illicit, their talent flirts with the criminal. So here's a painting called Reproduction, and in the little, this is entirely painted, and in the lower left, there's a little painted newspaper clippings, and one of them has a vignette of the artist kind of hunched over under lamplight doing his sort of furtive business, and the other one has a title called The Counterfeiter, and both of these mention the name of the artist who painted this work. So not only are trompe-l'oeil paintings literally designed to visually deceive, but they also flourished at a time when American politics was dominated by debates about the deceptiveness of money. So this debate was centered on whether banknotes, paper bills, should be backed by gold. And so during the Civil War in the 19th century, the government issued paper money that was not backed by precious metal in bank vaults called greenbacks. And but their use after the war was over was very controversial. And so on one side you have the sort of conservative, usually wealthy contingent often called gold bugs, who were advocating that you have have to have the gold standard because it secured the value of money, prevented inflation. And then on the other side, you have more often people who were of more working class backgrounds, or also people from other rural regions who called greenbackers, who argued that if you have paper currency without gold, you would stimulate the economy because there were problems of cash scarcity, especially in rural areas. And so this was a really kind of ongoing debate, and even though the gold standard was restored, in fact, in 1879, this debate was ongoing and persisted, and it was sort of most active during depression eras of depression during that time, and this debate went on until the gold standard was more or less abandoned in the 1930s. So animating this debate was the question of whether unbacked paper money was a con. And there was a question yesterday about whether all money is a con because it's not backed. And so this is very much a central question during this time. So could something in and of itself worthless, paper, secure value as opposed to something inherently valuable like gold? So this is really the core of the question. And trompe-l'oeil paintings like this one keyed into that instability. So in deceiving viewers into mistaking a painting for the real thing, these artists were underscoring these political concerns about paper money as if to say, paper money, like painting, is just an illusion, so you can imagine there's a kind of discourse there. So in monetary politics of the period, unbacked currency was often compared to art. So it wasn't just the artists who were thinking about this issue. So in this cartoon, political cartoon, paper money is imagined as a kind of work of artistic imitation. So all of the economic transactions depicted here are actually the traffic of mere images. So you have milk tickets for actual milk given to a fake baby. You have a cow that is real by the act of an artist, a house by the act of an architect. And then, of course, you have this is money by the act of Congress. And I think it's the play is, to get you to think about the act of con. So money is unstable then in both political and literal terms. While these debates were going on, the actual counterfeiting of currency was also rampant. One account estimated that the most skillful offenders were putting out hundreds of thousands of dollars a year into circulation, and that they were freely passed without suspicion through thousands of people. So for Americans, it was the artistry of false money that proved most fascinating. Since making counterfeits and recognizing them relied on visual acuity and manual dexterity, it was readily linked to the production and viewing of art. So in a counterfeit detector, and these are some examples of counterfeit detectors, these were publications that were designed to help people recognize false bills. And in one of these, the Treasury Department officer who wrote the kind of introduction to it says that comparing fake and genuine banknotes would actually help people to, quote, better appreciate the beautiful and valuable art of engraving and to enjoy the work of artists of the past and the present. So there is in the problem of counterfeiting, there's the silver lining is a kind of art appreciation. And counterfeiters themselves actually sometimes gained fame as artists. So during the 1880s and 90s, there was a counterfeiter popularly known as Jim the Penman, who was active in New York. And he made these hand-drawn ink and wash banknotes. The upper one is one of his works compared to the genuine below it. And after his arrest in 1896, an editorial published in the New York Sun proposed that he should be pardoned on the grounds of the artistic merit of his work. And this editorialist noted that this counterfeiter's art, he called it art, was so valuable that no one who owned one of these pieces, by accident because they were duped, would part with it for even double its face value. So there's now this market for fake money. So it's almost as if now that they've been given authorship, these bills can no longer be in circulation as money, but in that process, they've become art. So the murkiness of categories with regard to money and art also animated the counterfeiting of paintings. And this was particularly apparent in the case of Ralph Blakelock. So I want to return to him to think about this some more. So the type of falsification associated with Blakelock was remarkably reminiscent of the crimes associated with money. So with the nationalization of currency in the 1860s, so now you have a national mint producing money for the whole country, counterfeiters of money had to develop sophisticated criminal networks for dispersing their products. And New York's Bowery District became a center of this industry. So it was run by magnates who were conducting deals, and they were employing these vast numbers of low-paid workers who were skilled at engraving and distributing their work nationally. So this Jim the Penman was a kind of anomaly in the counterfeiting world of that time. And in the press, Blakelock's counterfeiters were described as in the terms of a kind of industry of counterfeiting. So they were described as the product of industrial mass production and national circulation. So one newspaper reported that, quote, there is a factory somewhere in Brooklyn where clever artists are turning out scores of Blakelocks that defy detection. And another announced that these were made by, quote unquote, a Western syndicate. It's doubtful that there really was a factory or this kind of criminal network around Blakelock's paintings, but it's pointed that these paintings were assumed to have monetary identities in that sense. And Blakelock's main paintings assumed their role as money in other ways as well, ways that I think return to the central concerns about hard and soft money, gold-backed versus fiat currency that I earlier outlined. So this is what I mean. As forgeries, they mimic the characteristics of paper money. So they're mechanically produced, rapidly circulated, on the pretense of authenticity. But as genuine artifacts, the authentic pictures, the story about those recalls us the understanding or the mythologies around metallic currency, the sort of idea of gold as having solid and intrinsic value. And Blakelock was known for paintings that were very thickly painted and heavily varnished canvases. So these are two details from his work, so to give you an idea of the kind of surfaces they have. And they were frequently compared to precious materials. So critics called them luminous, like an enamel, textured, like polished ivory. They called to mind rare and expensive artifacts. This jewel-like quality was a result of this very time-consuming process that Blakelock had for painting. It involved layering, sanding, varnishing. It took a long time. The canvases are very thick with paint. And it was something that was described quite regularly in published accounts of the artist's work, so we know that it was something that people thought was important. And in part because this is also very unusual for the period we are talking about, in which paintings get increasingly more and more abstract and the canvases get barer. So just think, of like Impressionism and Whistler to give you a kind of idea of the difference. So in other words, with Blakelock, you have an artist committed to a kind of material accumulation that yields these very sturdy and precious objects, things that are rather than these kind of barely covered pictures and sketchy visions. So it is no coincidence, I think, that in the 1890s, when Blakelock was painting this way, there was a strong uptick in the hoarding of gold because of the monetary instabilities of the time. So faced with the possibility that the gold standard would be abolished, Americans were exchanging their paper money for gold at such rates that banks and the Treasury Department were alarmed. And hoarding gold was during this period imagined as a kind of aesthetic enterprise. So economists were thinking about hoarding as this problem that if you have money that's gold, people will value it aesthetically, so it'll be too beautiful, and therefore you wouldn't be able to circulate it. So in the 19th century, then, hoarding was a kind of problem that of people valuing money as art. So the story goes that, when Blakelock was, so I will jump a little bit because I'm running out of time. But Blakelock's art then, I think, acts as a kind of monetary hoarding in that it's actually a kind of aesthetic accumulation for aesthetic ends, material accumulation. The fact that Blakelock stops painting this way after his breakdown is especially meaningful because instead of making these paintings that were kind of about a kind of solid currency, he starts making fake paper money. So the artist who spends his whole life in patient accumulation, transforming pain into a kind of precious object, with his descent into madness, there's a conversion. He, in a way, undergoes a conversion from being a gold bug to a greenbacker, one who is resistant to economic abstraction, to one who embraces the attendant instabilities of paper money and even exploits its qualities as con. So during this period of financial volatility, full of concerns about the trustworthiness of currency, art is liable to take on the characteristics of money and money those of art. We are reminded just how much our understanding of financial stability relies on an aesthetic vocabulary of illusionism, imitation, surfaces, and depth. And this is not just at the turn of the 20th century. And because of the politically motivated sort of ideas behind this event, I couldn't help but end with just a note about Trump, particularly because it involves both a mad artist and a bathroom fixture, which are both already have made appearances. And I won't go into this in detail, but this is just a story that broke earlier this year. We learned that Donald Trump had requested to borrow from the Guggenheim Van Gogh's Winter Landscape on the left. And the curator, Nancy Spector of the Guggenheim, declined that request and offered instead, in deadpan manner, this piece by the very provocative Italian contemporary artist Maurizio Cattelan called America, which is a 18-karat gold toilet that had been installed in a bathroom at the Guggenheim last year. So we have a kind of transaction, negotiation going on here that's not just about art, but about money too. Trump's choice is a kind of artwork that has been vetted by the market for over 100 years, and a kind of sound investment, you might say. Whereas the curator's offer, I think, is a kind of valiant effort to con the con man, to offer him an artwork that is valuable because it is literally made of money. This sort of gold, once the backing of all American money, and now putting on display a kind of literal solid currency in contrast to the president's own kind of material falseness, you might say, because we know that his residences are full of gilt objects. So the notion of a literal value the literal value of an object in the place of the market value that Trump would claim is his area of expertise. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Maggie. We're going to jump right away to the conclusion. Thank you, Maggie and Lainey, for wonderful presentations. Can you hear me now? Yes, good. Wonderful presentations where there's so many connecting threads. I'm going to open it up to your questions in a minute, so if I can start showing hands. Before I do that, I just want to point out the ways in which both your papers sort of show this transvaluation of values between art and the economy that seem to be very much present in both of stories, and the way that you both present the forger as a figure that it's to be unlocked either from the world of journalism or the world of art history for all the information that this figure holds about this relationship of the art and the economy, in a way that whenever a work of art we think of it as a forger, it's not just the art in itself, but all of the other objects and devices that are forged around it, from bureaucracies, documents, identities, as you showed so well, social constructs, and also ultimately money. So again, to sort of, as I noted in the introduction, to sort of position these art objects beyond the visual realm alone and within a much broader realm of cultural and political economy. And again, I think that these are the objects that can unlock a lot of the dynamics of politics as per today. And I think that you ended up with this object where the transvaluation of values from the art to the money, so it's sort of materialized in an object in the story itself. It's very helpful. I have more questions, but I'm going to open it. We're going to have the mic distributed. If you can please introduce yourself as you ask your question, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, my question is, wealthy people who are conned on these on the forged art, how does that happen? These are people, if they buy, a luxury apartment, they bring in lawyers, they bring in all kinds of experts. If they buy a company, they bring in experts. What is it about art that causes them not to bring the experts in to evaluate it? And how is it also, you mentioned the statistics on the Met that, this percentage that was conned forged art. How did that happen at the Met? I mean, they have internal experts. Did they just not have anyone look at those? And finally, the admiration that people have for the con in the art world, which seems a little bit different than, normally people may not admire con people, but in the art world there seems to be an admiration for that. And could you be a little bit more specific on why that is? Is it that they're, basically stealing from the rich, or is it their technical ability, or what exactly creates the difference when you get to art from, other things?
Thank you.
I mean, I can only sort of speak for the case can only really speak for the case I was researching, but there were a couple dealers who were representing wealthy clients who went to go get an artwork authenticated and didn't like the answer they got. So at some point, trying to figure out whether an artwork is authentic or not does come down to subjectivity as well. So I think that's always the gray area that people argue over. And then you combine that with, I don't want to knock all art dealers. It's also a very hair-raising, high-risk profession because they are dealing with people who are quite powerful and wealthy, and one person can sink them. So when they do have a good fish on the line, I think often the motivation to make a deal overtakes what should be a higher goal, which is to try and prevent fakes from hitting the market, whether just from hitting the market. And I think sometimes my impression with some is that, these are things that the wealthy could afford it if they made a mistake. They're not experts either. They can't become experts because you do have to know an artist's canon and you have to be able to analyze brushstrokes. Dealers are also reluctant to take a piece of the artwork and have it looked at, take some paint off to go get it authenticated. If someone did that with Myatt's works, he would have been caught on day one. But they don't want to tamper with it because it also is costly. So I think that's part of the issue, the subjectivity of it. I forgot the rest of the second part of the question, but.
admiration through their technical
Yeah.
skill, or what creates the difference there?
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. Many people feel, from people I've spoken with, that they feel that these people deserved it. They should have known better. Because once you did, think of the one forger who, just even Myatt, he took house paint, Benjamin Moore, and brought it and just, and some of the works really were bad. The problem in that con is John Drew, when he made his documentation, his forged provenance that went with the works, he conned his way into the research institutes that protect the archives. Most archives are on guard for people stealing stuff. They're not on guard for people putting it in. So he was putting his fake documentation into the archives, slipping it in, so that when there was an argument over authenticity, you would just go to the archive and say, well, here it is. It's real. Here's the picture. Here's the photograph.
Yeah.
So he complicated it that way, too.
Do you want to address, please, Maggie?
Well, I do think that the technical ability is really key, because I think there's a sense in which the artist is admired for the ability to fool you. So there's, the tradition of artworks that fool the viewer is a very long one, and some of which I discussed, but it goes back to antiquity. And I think there is this admiration for artists who can, through their illusionism, trick you, and that's part of the discourse of art as a successful artwork, and that plays into the forger's identity.
Yeah, I think that came through very clearly, that the con artist is the ultimate artist, because it's perfecting sort of this ability for illusion, and sort of linking it to your talk. He becomes successful as a sort of social agent of fascination if he or she is caught. So the fascination is dependent on them being caught, and therefore sort of revealing the art as an institution of the elites. So that sort of, he never ceases to be an artist, bottom line. We have
I have one comment and one question, sir. Thanks. I have a comment and a question. The comment is to suggest that maybe you could enlarge, so to speak, the canvas of analysis with the following comparison. I was prompted to think of this by your mentioning genuine fakes. So if we want to encourage the marketing of art for the sake of art, that is, you put it on your wall and you enjoy looking at it, then why don't we encourage genuine fakes? And the analogy would be to say, in just a way we encourage generic drugs. Generic drugs do perform the same function, they're efficacious, they're safe because they're vetted by the FDA. Okay, so why don't we have some kind of good collector's seal of approval in which genuine fakes are vetted, and then they're on the market, and that might diminish the degree of crime. So that's just a suggestion. Here's the question. The flip side of forgery and fakery is authenticity. So what does authenticity mean today in certain areas of art, which might be produced by 3D printers, which might be produced by as metal sculptures, might be produced by other kinds of authentic, accurate reproductive techniques. If we care about just the aesthetic appreciation of it, then if you make a work of art that uses a 3D printer, and then I just reproduce it, what's the difference between your work and my reproduction?
You want to do Walter Benjamin?
So I think with regard to the first comment, I think there, in a way, you could argue that already exists, because there is an industry for commercial fake art, I'd say, most of it being made in China by studios of painters who are trained to imitate styles. So this isn't forgery in the sense of trying to be duplicitous, but just you want to have a Van Gogh, you can purchase that now. With regard to the question about the technical reproduction of artworks, I think this is an issue that is not just a contemporary issue but now it's, it has been an issue with photography and printmaking before as technical possibilities of reproducing works of art. I think now we have the problem of technologies allowing you to reproduce art in three-dimensional sense. So you can actually, and it does happen for, to aid seeing impaired people. There is a sort of projects of reproducing canvases so that they can be touched. So it's not necessarily always for the wrong reasons that these technologies can be used for their reproductive possibilities. But I do think it does point to the issue of authenticity having a new degree of nuance in that how do you understand authenticity if you can reproduce something that is materially exact. Then where is the author, what happens to authorship? And I think it maybe is not so different from the same questions that were asked of that in a previous era of new mediums.
And sometimes it's just knowing. I mean, knowing it was done by Picasso brings in all this history and understanding of who Picasso was as opposed to the fake. And that requires a leap of faith and understanding to feel that way. But all those works were done at a unique time in history. And I think Walter Benjamin.
And also, I mean, there's this history also in which, regardless of the hope that means of mechanical reproduction will sort of bring out the aura of authenticity, in fact, reifies it. The fact that you have all of these reproductions of Picassos all over the world only sort of emphasize the authenticity of its original. So it's sort of a tension that has not quite been solved. And the new techniques, it's how they will reposition authenticity or authority, it's still up for grabs. Let's take these two questions. No, I think we have time for these two questions. Yes.
Thank you. In your talks, neither one of you mentioned the long connection of art and propaganda and the connection to the state. And so if art just sits there and is on the wall and you can see it, right, and the buyer can see it and it's pleasing to the eye, then is not really the real reason that forgery is a crime is because it actually attacks the propaganda of art. And why should we use tax dollars to prosecute forgeries?
Go ahead. Do you know? I think I'm not quite sure. I may not be sure of the question.
Two-part question. Is forgery really just an attack on the propaganda of art?
For some.
As far as the state, you look at churches, you look at ancient Greece, you look at how art has been used to prop up the state. So is it not an attack, and is that not the reason that it is also illegal?
It's illegal because it's fraud. I mean, Mark Landis. No, but I mean, Mark Landis. He was never charged with a crime because he gave it away. If he had taken $1, he would have been arrested and charged with a crime. So it's saying it's the fraud part. So that's why it's illegal. Sorry, go ahead.
Sort of goes back to the question of authority from before. No, the assignation of authenticity seems to be what's at stake. Let's take one more question.
And the motivation of the painter.
One more? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first, I wonder if you could comment about the case involving the Bingham Civil War secretary that just happened, where this man faked the Civil War secretary. It was sold to Alan Katz, who's the premier Americana dealer in America. It was sold at the Armory show where every piece is supposedly vetted. It was bought by the Wadsworth Athenaeum for $340,000 and it was on display there. and until the forger just revealed the fact that it was a forgery. So that's the first question. And the second is, how can we really talk about authenticity when much of the art is produced by assistants?
I mean, it's known throughout history. I mean, even Rembrandt, you know, in his workshops, he had artists who specialized in hands. You know, so a lot of people are realizing now that a Rembrandt wasn't always just done by Rembrandt. He would have 5 or 6 people working on one painting. And I think the discussion among art scholars is, how do we represent the painting now? Is it fully by Rembrandt, or is it by Rembrandt and his assistants? So I think in terms of when assistants are involved, it's just like when you have a piece of writing. When do you have a triple byline, or when do you have a single byline? You know, how many people were involved in the piece of art? So I think some people are just requesting more transparency from people who sell these works. You know, are they truly just by one person, or was it a workshop effort?
And I don't know any details about the case that you mentioned, but what I will say is that, you know, the idea of something passing as authentic until the forger reveals it very much points to the fact that often counterfeiting in the art world is very close to performance art, in that there is a whole category of artistic practice which involves a kind of audience interaction that circles around the notion of illusionism and deception. So, you know, it's very possible that you could imagine a forger working in the context of contemporary art that would understand their work, in fact, as a kind of performance. And, you know, there's examples of like a street artist putting their work in a museum and seeing that nobody notices it. So, you know, it could be argued that a con artist is, in fact, a legitimate artist in the terms of used in contemporary practice.
Was there one more question right there? Get the mic over here. I think this might be the last question.
There was a recent, rather well-known case involving the dealer Mary Boone, who, well, it's a fraud, it was a con, apparently. She sold the work to Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin had come to her asking for a very specific piece by an artist named Ross Bleckner that he had seen in her gallery some years previously, and he failed to act on it at the time, and he asked her to please see if she could get that work for him. And according to newspaper accounts, he received the work and didn't think it was quite right. It didn't smell right. It smelled new. So after a while, he was very suspicious, and he compared the work that he received to the reproduction of the work that he thought he was getting. And in fact, Mary Boone had gone to Ross Bleckner and asked him to reproduce the work. So she sold him a work by Bleckner, but not the one that he had wanted, and for a price that he probably wouldn't have felt justified in paying. So the artist was not necessarily counterfeiting anything. It was an authentic Bleckner, but the buyer was in fact deceived, and the dealer, I do not understand how she's why she's not in jail right now. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I just think that in general, this really is one of the largest unregulated markets out there, and it's getting, the value of it is getting larger and larger. And I think the biggest demand that a lot of people have is just transparency. They are not transparent in a lot of their business practices. So there's room for questionable behavior. And it's difficult to take people to court, because if you even have a murmur that a painting's a fake, they could sue you for libel or disparagement of product. So it's also a difficult nut to crack in that sense. I'm not sure about this, but I don't think, when I think of journalism, which is what I'm in, I mean, we have to be transparent. I have to tell people if I don't know anything, if I don't know the answer to a question in a story. If I have documents that I'm quoting from, I put them up on the website so you can go see the documents yourself. We don't have that kind of transparency in the art market. And the public can police me, as they should, but I don't know who's policing the art market. I don't know if they have actually a policing system.
Do you want to?
Because I don't know what you can do with that dealer.
Right.
I understand why she's still in business, quite honestly. If you would deliberately deceive a customer,
Yeah.
why don't you put on jail as another question?
Yeah,
I think this is a provoking story, adding to the story of how art and the market intertwine, and how I think both our presentations have called for expertise, artistic expertise, the historian's expertise, and the rigor of the journalist to sort of call attention to these problematics in the economy today. And with that, I want to ask for your help in thanking them for their presence.